Have you ever wondered what would happen if the wealthiest person you knew suddenly became penniless, if only for a few days? This is the story of Alexander Morgan, a multi-millionaire who decided to shed his luxuries, put on ragged clothes, and blend into a world far from private jets and grand yachts. He was tired of seeing people treat him differently just because of his money. So, with determination and a simple disguise, he set out to discover the truth about human nature, who truly cared about him as a person and who was only there for the zeros in his bank account. Alexander Morgan's life was a testament to opulence and grandeur. He was the sole heir to the massive Morgan & Fields conglomerate, a corporation started by his grandfather that specialized in everything from real estate to luxury resorts. At 32, Alexander had experienced every comfort money could buy: penthouse apartments in multiple cities, a custom yacht moored in Monaco, exotic sports cars, and a wardrobe that would make celebrities envious. People clamored to be in his presence, to receive just a fragment of his wealth, or to ride the wave of his lavish parties. Over time, however, Alexander grew suspicious. Were his relationships genuine? Did people actually care about him, or did they merely want to leech off his endless resources? These questions gnawed at him until a bold idea crystallized in his mind. His plan began on a mundane Tuesday morning in New York City. The rattle of the city's subway served as a stark backdrop for his transformation. Inside an unremarkable studio apartment he secretly leased under the name Alex Brown, Alexander had only the bare essentials: a small bed, a rickety table, a single chair, and a makeshift closet with just a few T-shirts and jeans. None of the items suggested he was a man of extraordinary wealth. He stashed his credit cards and expensive suits in a locked trunk and dressed in tattered jeans and worn-out sneakers. Instead of stepping into his usual limousine, he took the subway downtown, inhaling the blend of sweat, coffee, and newspapers that emanated from weary commuters. Alexander's first task was to test the authenticity of some of the people he considered friends. A week earlier, he had fabricated a story about a financial crisis, cautioning them he might need time away from his extravagant social obligations. He even dropped hints that he had lost a chunk of his assets due to a bad investment in a South American mining venture. Now, he wanted to see how they would react if he presented himself as destitute, living paycheck to paycheck, if he even had a paycheck at all. He arrived at his regular social club, the Lindbergh Lounge, where millionaires sipped cocktails in velvet chairs, discussing the latest acquisitions or philanthropic galas. Standing outside in a threadbare jacket and cheap hood, he felt out of place in a setting that he had previously strolled into with unshakable confidence. The doorman, who once smiled broadly at the sight of him, now regarded him with disdain, unsure if he should even allow him in. But with a half-hearted wave from Alexander, whose face was somewhat recognizable, he was permitted to enter. Inside, his so-called friends barely registered him. Nathaniel Reed, a hedge fund manager with whom Alexander had played countless rounds of golf, looked at him with a brief flicker of confusion. Nathaniel must have been thinking, why on earth is Alexander dressed like that? But he made no effort to speak or ask if Alexander needed help. In fact, he quickly turned his back, focusing on the screens that displayed stock tickers. Another friend, Samantha Grant, a socialite famous for her appearances at every high-class charity event, gave Alexander a perfunctory nod, hurriedly turning away when she noticed the scuffed shoes and the stubble that hinted Alexander was not quite the groomed figure she knew. The vibe in the lounge was clear. If he was no longer a shiny beacon of luxury, then he might as well be invisible. Unperturbed, Alexander made his way to the bar. With what little cash he had in his pockets, a few wrinkled dollar bills, he ordered water instead of his usual top-shelf whiskey. He sipped quietly, trying not to be offended by the glances cast in his direction. But The final blow came when he approached the table where he typically held court, regaling guests with stories of business deals or philanthropic projects. Only two people were there that day, Nathaniel Reed and Charles Linton, a real estate mogul who was once eager to partner with Alexander on a new resort. They gave him an awkward greeting, and Charles half-jokingly mentioned, "Tough times, huh, Alex? Maybe you'll bounce back." There was no genuine concern, no invitation to sit and chat about life's troubles, no offer of a friendly handshake, just a dismissive brush-off. Within minutes, they found excuses to leave the table, effectively abandoning him. Alexander's heart sank, though he had anticipated the possibility of rejection. Feeling it happen in real time struck him like a hammer. Nonetheless, he pressed on with his experiment. He needed a broader perspective, needed to see how strangers might treat him. He decided to visit one of the smaller businesses owned by the Morgan and Fields, conglomerate, a down-to-earth diner in Brooklyn named Hazel's Cozy Corner, reputed for its friendly atmosphere and homemade pies. He entered the diner, which was a world apart from the sumptuous clubs he was used to. A bell chimed above the door. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the smell of bacon, coffee, and toasted bread enveloped the place. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Deborah Myers, saw Alexander's shabby clothes, yet welcomed him with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, have a seat wherever you like." He chose a booth near the window. Deborah came by and introduced herself. "What can I get you, sweetie?" Alexander hesitated. He hadn't expected such genuine friendliness. It took him a moment to answer, "Just coffee, please." "Black." "Sure thing," she said, walking away cheerfully. Deborah returned with a steaming mug, placing a small saucer of creamers beside it. "You sure you don't want anything else? We have a turkey special that's only a few bucks." Alexander was unsure how far to push his disguise, but he decided to remain consistent. "I'll just stick to the coffee for now, kind of on a tight budget." He forced an embarrassed smile, wondering how a waitress would respond. Deborah nodded, concern etched on her face. "Understood, honey. If you change your mind, holler. And let me know if you need anything at all." She patted him gently on the shoulder before leaving. It was a small gesture, perhaps unremarkable to many, but in the context of Alexander's emotional state, it felt like a life raft of kindness in a sea of indifference. The next few hours were a whirlwind of introspection. Alexander sipped his coffee slowly, making it last so he could observe the diner's clientele. Most people here were working-class drivers, teachers on lunch break, local families. They came in for a quick meal, for the friendly banter with Deborah and the cook, or just to escape the cold. This was a far cry from the high society circles he was used to, but what he saw brought unexpected comfort, genuine camaraderie. Strangers helped an elderly man to his seat. A mother gently scolded her teenage daughter for texting at the table while explaining the importance of family. A local policeman greeted everyone cheerfully. It was as though money or social status mattered little in this tiny enclave. This authenticity reached a part of Alexander's soul he thought had withered. Deborah came by again. "Refill, sweetie?" "It's on the house." Alexander nodded. "Thank you so much." She grinned, pouring him another cup. "Anything else?" He glanced at the menu. "Actually, maybe I'll have a slice of pie." "I hear your pies are famous." She beamed. "Best in Brooklyn. Let me get you a slice of the cherry." When she returned and placed the pie in front of him, Alexander engaged her in conversation. "So, do you like working here?" Deborah shrugged. "It's not glamorous, and the pay's nothing special, but Hazel's Cozy Corner is like a family. I've been waitressing here for over 15 years. Got 2 kids in college, Luke and Brianna, and this place helped me put them through school. And, I get to meet all kinds of people. That's a blessing in its own way." He studied her kind, lined face, and he felt an urge to reveal himself. The only thing stopping him was his experiment. Instead, he asked. "Do you ever have days when you wish you were somewhere else?" She paused, then offered a wry smile. "Of course, but fancy jobs come with fancy problems. My sister works at an insurance firm, and she's stressed out of her mind. My boss, Hazel, is a good woman. She's always helped me out if I needed an advance or time off. Hard to find that these days." Then Deborah leaned in a bit. "We get all kinds here. Rich folks, poor folks, tourists, everyone. Funny thing is, by the time they settle down in a booth for a bite to eat, we're all the same. People are people." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. That simple philosophy cut through all his cynicism. He finished his pie in contemplative silence. Before leaving, he made sure to leave a generous tip, though he didn't want to blow his disguise, so he tucked away a folded 20 on the table. For once, that small action felt more fulfilling than any extravagance he'd indulged in recently. The day continued with a visit to a shelter downtown. In secret, Morgan and Fields donated regularly to this shelter, the Strickland Haven. Alexander typically wrote checks from his plush office, but he had never visited it personally. Now, disguised as a broke man, he walked through its doors. The difference between writing a check and seeing the people who benefited from it face to face overwhelmed him. Children played in a cramped, worn-out space, their laughs oddly blending with the hum of an old heating system. Adults queued for a meal of rice, beans, and bread, each holding a plastic tray. A volunteer coordinator, a young man named Carlos Trevino, greeted him. Carlos had no idea who Alexander really was. "Welcome. Are you here to volunteer or need a meal?" he asked politely. Alexander glanced around at the queue. For a second, he considered just staying quiet, receiving food as if he were in need. But a wave of guilt washed over him. Yes, he was in disguise, but to take a meal away from someone who genuinely needed it felt unethical. "So," he replied, "I was actually hoping to see if I could help." Carlos's eyes lit up. "We always need extra hands. You okay washing dishes or handing out food?" "Yes, absolutely," Alexander answered, surprising himself. He couldn't recall the last time he'd done manual labor, but something about it felt right. Within an hour, he was behind the counter, wearing a smock, scooping beans onto trays. At first, it was awkward. He had no idea how to hold the ladle properly or manage the flow of hungry visitors. But with a bit of guidance from Carlos, he found a rhythm. As person after person came for their meal, Alexander realized these individuals were not just nameless faces. They were fathers, mothers, grandparents, children, people who had stories, some tragic, some hopeful, but all undeniably human. One man, Richard Johnson, struck up a brief conversation. He wore a battered coat and his hands shook from the cold. As Alexander scooped beans onto Richard's tray, the man asked, "Ever been down on your luck, son?" Alexander forced a sympathetic smile. "You could say, I'm a bit down on mine right now." He didn't have the heart to elaborate further. Richard offered a nod. "Don't let it break your spirit. I worked as a builder for 30 years until the recession hit. Lost my home, lost everything, but I come here for a warm meal, and it keeps me going. We all have to help each other, you know." Alexander nodded, feeling a rush of guilt. Here he stood, a man with overflowing resources, hearing from someone who had genuinely lost everything. Richard's optimism in the face of true adversity contrasted starkly with the superficial positivity of the socialites who always hovered around Alexander for a chance to glean some wealth. That night, Alexander returned to his tiny rented studio. His muscles ached from a day spent on his feet, and his mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Exhausted, he threw himself onto the bed. Amid the throbbing pain in his lower back and the lingering smell of detergent from the shelter, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's experiences, though challenging, had been more rewarding than any business deal. It was a strange realization. In living as a broke man, he felt more alive than ever before. The week progressed in a similar fashion. Each day he ventured out, immersing himself in situations that were once foreign to him. He spent time at a local church's soup kitchen, chatted with bus drivers, and frequented public libraries, discovering how people connected with one another without the veil of wealth. Each step brought revelations that touched him deeply. Eventually, news spread among certain circles, namely, those who had long orbited around Alexander's fortune, that he might be experiencing financial ruin. The whispers were subtle at first, then more brash. He received texts from acquaintances who pretended to offer support, but their words seemed hollow. A few demanded clarification on whether he could still fund their ventures or attend their lavish gatherings. One of the cruelest messages came from a high society friend, Elena Roberts, who wrote, "Heard the rumors, dear. Is it true you can't even afford your staff? That must be humiliating. Let me know if you need a loan." Wink. Alexander read that text with a mix of anger and sorrow. He realized how fragile and transactional these relationships were, built mostly on his ability to entertain, to fund, to lavish. Though it stung, it also freed him. His illusions were shattered, leaving him with unfiltered truth. These people were never truly his friends. Amid these harsh realizations, however, something else bloomed, a genuine connection. Every time he visited Hazel's cozy corner, Deborah greeted him like an old friend. She never pried into his life, but offered words of comfort or a warm meal. After a few days, he learned that she had been struggling to pay her mortgage. Her daughter's tuition was skyrocketing, and her husband had left her years ago. Despite her problems, Deborah remained kind and welcoming. In an act that nearly brought tears to his eyes, she once gave him a free slice of pie, saying, "You look like you could use something sweet." For Alexander, who could buy entire bakeries without a second thought, this gesture was priceless because it was an authentic act of generosity from someone who had little to spare. A few nights later, Alexander visited the Strickland Haven again, hoping to continue volunteering. One of the coordinators pulled him aside. "We're short on supplies, especially winter coats. We're doing a coat drive. Do you know anyone who might donate?" Alexander paused. If he were to tap into his personal wealth, it would reveal his true identity. But these people needed help now, and it felt impossible to stand by, especially when he had the means to solve the problem. He made a discreet phone call to his personal assistant, someone he trusted implicitly, using a burner phone, instructing him to anonymously donate a large sum to the shelter's coat drive. Within 24 hours, a truck arrived at the Strickland Haven loaded with brand new winter coats, scarves, and gloves. The label on the boxes read simply, "From a friend." The staff cheered, and tears streamed down some faces at the unexpected generosity. Alexander watched from the background, quietly helping unload the boxes. Each person in need who received a coat lit up with gratitude, oblivious to the identity of their benefactor. And that was exactly how Alexander wanted it. The experience moved him in a way that felt unfamiliar. Never before had he given so directly without expecting social praise or media coverage, and it filled his heart more than any magazine headline about his philanthropy ever could. As the second week of Alexander's experiment drew to a close, he decided it was time to push his plan further. He wanted to see how certain close associates, people like his personal banker or his investment advisor, would respond if he walked into their offices dressed as a broke man. On a chilly morning, he slipped into an old coat and beanie, took the subway to the Manhattan headquarters of the Morgan and Fields building, and marched right up to the front desk. The lobby had always been a testament to the company's success: marble floors, an elaborate chandelier, and a row of impeccably dressed receptionists. One receptionist, Samantha Cole, recognized him, but struggled to maintain composure upon seeing his shabby appearance. She stammered, Mr. Morgan, is everything all right? Do you have an appointment? Alexander suppressed a wry smile. I'm here to see Jeff Henderson, my investment advisor. But let's say it's a surprise visit. Samantha's eyes darted around. Of course. Let me check if he's available. She looked visibly nervous, unsure how to treat this scenario. Moments later, she guided him to the private elevator. As the elevator ascended, Alexander braced himself for another hard truth. When Jeff Henderson saw Alexander in ragged clothes, his mouth fell open. Jeff had known Alexander for years, managing his portfolios and large-scale investments. He'd grown accustomed to Alexander's impeccable suits and confident stride. The disheveled figure before him was a jarring change. Alex, are you all right? I heard rumors something had happened, but I didn't believe them. Alexander shrugged. Jeff, I wanted to talk about the status of my accounts, see if I'm truly as ruined as people say. Would you have time to go over the numbers with me? Jeff nodded emphatically. Of course. But, Alex, this look, is it for real? Alexander paused. Let's just say I've had a change in lifestyle. I need to know who stands by me and who doesn't. Jeff cleared his throat. Well, I'm with you. Always have been, always will be. But you should know, some business partners have been making calls, wanting to distance themselves from you. They're concerned about a possible meltdown in your finances. Alexander nodded, unsurprised. And do you feel that way? Jeff looked at him squarely. I'm your advisor. My loyalty is to you, not just your money. But you look exhausted. If you need anything, a place to stay, alone, let me know. It was a small gesture, but a genuine one. As it turned out, Jeff Henderson was among the few who truly cared. Alexander's heart warmed with relief, realizing not everyone in his orbit was solely a fair-weather friend. Jeff opened up the latest financial statements and pointed out that, aside from the rumored fiasco with the South American mining venture, which was actually a minor setback rather than a colossal loss, Alexander's net worth was still robust. He showed no sign of wanting to sever ties or jump ship. Before leaving, Alexander placed a hand on Jeff's shoulder. Thank you, Jeff. I won't forget this. A day later, Alexander received a call from one of his old philanthropic partners, Paul Kowalski, a businessman from Detroit. Paul had seen the news swirling around about Alexander's rumored downfall. Rather than offering a helping hand, Paul demanded that Alexander pay back the portion of funds he had pledged for a joint charity event or else face legal action. The man who once boasted about doing good for the underprivileged was now panicking that Alexander's possible financial crash would taint his own reputation. With each phone call like this, Alexander's sadness and sense of betrayal grew. By the end of the second week, Alexander had a heart-wrenching tapestry of experiences. On one side stood the cold, opportunistic acquaintances who vanished the moment his gold appeared to lose its sheen. On the other side existed Deborah Myers from the diner, Richard Johnson and others at the shelter, Carlos Trevino, and even Jeff Henderson, people who either offered kindness or loyalty without caring about his presumed poverty. These experiences forced Alexander to reckon with deeper truths about himself. For so long, he had used money as a shield, a way to keep the world at arm's length. It never occurred to him how deeply he could connect with others if he removed that barrier. One evening, the emotional weight became too much. He sat in the cramped studio, tears rolling down his cheeks. Memories from his childhood surfaced his mother's gentle guidance, teaching him the importance of compassion, his father's stern lectures about safeguarding the family fortune. He realized how far he had strayed from the values he was taught as a boy. It wasn't just about giving money, It was about living in a way that honored the humanity of those around him. The tears that fell weren't just from the betrayals he'd witnessed, but also from the kindness and love he'd discovered in places he least expected. During one final visit to the Strickland Haven, Richard Johnson approached him with a broad grin. "Hey son, I found something that might fit you better." He extended a woolen jacket, worn but clean. "My brother gave me this last week, but I already have one. Thought you might need it." Alexander's throat tightened. Richard, who had so little, wanted to give what meager extra he had to a man he believed was struggling. I don't know what to say," Alexander stammered. "Just say yes," Richard insisted. No shame in accepting help. That moment crystallized everything. Alexander was a man with more money than he could ever spend, yet he was receiving a heartfelt gift from someone with almost nothing. He took the jacket, tears forming in his eyes. "Thank you, Richard. This means more than you know." "Ah, it's just a jacket," Richard said with a sheepish smile, patting Alexander's shoulder. "We're all in this together, right?" Alexander barely managed a nod, emotions choking his words. He stepped outside the shelter and into the crisp evening air, wearing Richard's jacket. He looked up at the moon and stars, feeling the universe expand around him. This was what it meant to be human, to share, to uplift each other, to see beyond class or wealth. The next morning, Alexander concluded his experiment. He left the dingy studio and returned to his penthouse, a surreal shift from the gritty reality he'd been living in for weeks. He stood in the foyer, marble floors gleaming under the chandelier, and felt a pang of alienation. For the first time, it seemed too large, too empty. The next few days, he discreetly paid visits to Deborah at Hazel's Cozy Corner and to the staff at the Strickland Haven. But this time, he arrived as himself, Alexander Morgan, the millionaire. He still wore modest clothing, but no longer hid who he was. The reactions were as poignant as they were revealing. At the diner, Deborah was wiping down a table when she saw him enter in well-tailored but understated clothes. He approached her gently. "Deborah, my real name is Alexander Morgan. I own Morgan & Fields, the company that owns this diner too. And his voice faltered, I just want to thank you. Your kindness meant everything to me." Deborah's mouth hung open. She fumbled with the cleaning rag. You own Hazel's Cozy Corner. You're that Alexander Morgan." For a moment, she looked flustered, like her entire world had shifted. But then she quickly composed herself and asked quietly, "Why were you dressed like?" Alexander explained everything: his test, his need to see genuine human compassion beyond the layers of wealth. He expressed his gratitude, tears forming in his eyes. Deborah, equally emotional, gave him a soft hug. "I never would have guessed," she whispered, "but I'm glad I could help in my own little way." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a sizable check. "Consider this a small token of my appreciation for your mortgage, your kids' tuition, anything you need. And I'd like to offer you a better position within Morgan & Fields if you're interested, something that comes with benefits and steady hours, but only if you want it." Deborah's voice trembled with gratitude. "I thank you, Mr. Morgan. I mean, Alex, this is too much." "Not at all," he said, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Your kindness is worth more than any check I could write." Later, Alexander visited the Strickland Haven in his usual black SUV, drawing a few curious stares. He found Carlos Trevino and Richard Johnson. With them, he repeated the same honest confession. Carlos exclaimed, "You're the reason that truckload of coats arrived. And you've been Morgan from Morgan & Fields?" Alexander nodded. He then turned to Richard. "And you gave me your extra jacket, even though you barely had enough for yourself. I can never repay that gesture of genuine kindness, but I'd like to try." He handed Richard a new set of clothes, boots, and an offer for a job as a supervisor in one of the company's warehouse facilities, complete with training, a stable salary, and a chance for growth. "You have real skill as a builder. I've seen your work ethic. With some support, you can get back on your feet." Richard stood speechless, eyes welling with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll accept," Alexander responded warmly. "You taught me something I'll never forget." With those acts, Alexander began a personal quest to reshape Morgan & Fields from the inside out. While the company had engaged in charity work before, it was mostly done for public relations. Now, he made it his mission to implement genuine policies, employee assistance programs, better wages, more direct involvement in community projects. He prioritized local businesses and grassroots initiatives, shifting the corporation's culture from the top down. Some of his old business partners balked at the changes, but Alexander held firm. He felt he'd uncovered a deep well of compassion within himself, and he refused to revert to hollow philanthropy or purely profit-driven decisions. True to form, many of his so-called friends who had vanished reappeared after learning he was, in fact, still incredibly wealthy. They groveled, apologized for not reaching out. Elena Roberts tried to mend fences by inviting him to an extravagant gala, claiming she'd been worried sick. Alexander saw through the charade. He politely declined, explaining he had other priorities like visiting the Strickland Haven for a new project or helping Deborah's daughter pick out her college dorm. In the weeks and months that followed, Alexander's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. His social calendar no longer bristled with meaningless events. Instead, he spent quality time with people who had shown him true kindness. He participated in potlucks with the diner staff, laughter echoing in small apartments where rent was sometimes overdue, but hearts were full of warmth. He saw how money could be a tool for genuine good if used wisely, not merely a means to inflate one's ego or social standing. People began to wonder about his reclusiveness from elite social circles. The tabloid speculated, Alexander Morgan emerges from rumored bankruptcy, changes lifestyle, completely what happened. But he ignored them. He'd discovered a deeper, more fulfilling life that transcended headlines. One evening, as Alexander strolled through Central Park in a simple jacket, the nights were growing colder again. He reflected on the twist his life had taken. He had gone on this journey believing he'd reveal the ugliness in others. And yes, he had indeed seen betrayal and greed, but he'd also discovered compassion in the unlikeliest places. He had found loyalty in individuals who didn't stand to gain a single cent from him, who offered him help or a kind word just because it was the decent thing to do. It humbled him, softened him, and, in many ways, saved him from drowning in a lonely world where relationships were mere transactions. That night, he pulled out his phone to send a message to Jeff Henderson. Let's discuss how we can expand the philanthropic branch of Morgan & Fields. Something truly meaningful. Meet me tomorrow? And with that, he moved forward into a new chapter of his life. The tears he had shed were not just for the pain of discovering false friends, but for the profound gratitude of uncovering real humanity, both within himself and in the people he once overlooked. By the time word of his transformation truly spread, Alexander Morgan was no longer recognized solely as the heir to a vast fortune, but as a man who had walked among the common folk, unguarded by wealth, and come away with a heart renewed. The lesson he learned transcended the ephemeral world of money. In the end, it's the kindness we give and the connections we forge that define who we are. If you've listened to Alexander Morgan's journey and felt a stir of emotion, you're not alone. This remarkable story of a millionaire stripping away his privilege to rediscover the powerful bonds of humanity reminds us that genuine compassion and kindness can come from anyone, at any time. No matter how much money you have, no matter how prestigious your job title, authenticity and empathy will always be priceless treasures. If Alexander's tears taught us anything, it's that we should cherish those who stand by us when we have nothing, for they reveal the true meaning of loyalty and love. Thank you so much for watching. If you found inspiration in Alexander's story, please hit that like button, share this video with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening tales. Every bit of support helps us bring you content that warms the heart and sparks the imagination. Stay kind, everyone.